The Verith relay had been half dead for 6 years before I arrived, and in all the time I spent there, I never once thought it would matter. That is the kind of thing you only understand looking back. They posted me to Verath in the second month after my discharge. A polite way of saying, they needed somewhere to put me that wasn't the capital, where I'd developed a habit of telling senior officials that their maps were wrong. The relay sat in a gravitational null point, 41,000 kilometers off the main transit corridor between the Orvan cluster and the inner systems. Its official function was biological census sweep. Every vessel passing through the corridor was required to stop, submit to the relay's bioscan array, and have its crew and passenger manifest confirmed against the galactic registry. It was tedious work. 90% of the scans produced nothing more interesting than confirmation of what was already on file. The other 10% produced instrument flags that turned out to be calibration errors, or passengers who'd had gene therapy they hadn't declared, or the occasional working animal whose genome sat in an ambiguous classification zone and required a human judgment call. In 23 years, as a cartographer for the Survey Corps, I had developed a particular tolerance for instrument flags. You learn to read them the way you learn to read any kind of signal, not just for what they say, but for what they're trying to say. A scanner, like a map, is an argument about what exists. It can be wrong, it can be biased, it can be deliberately degraded by parties who have an interest in what it does or doesn't record. But it can also be right when everything else says it shouldn't be. That had been, in the end, the thing that got me reassigned to Verath. I'd been mapping the Cathuri Deeps, a region the Survey Corps had written off as uninhabited for 60 years, and I kept finding settlement traces the official charts said weren't there. Thermal gradients, residue patterns consistent with habitation, subsurface density anomalies. Filed 3 reports. All 3 came back with the same language. Instrument artifact, no corroborating evidence. The calibrated equipment that finally arrived had been preset to exclude the frequency ranges where I'd found my traces. I filed a formal objection. 6 weeks later, a senior administrator explained that my contract was concluding, and there was a posting available at the Verath relay. I accepted it. I was 51, my knee was giving me trouble, and I had no desire to fight. The relay was a ring of scanner arrays around a central processing hub, 8 docking cradles and a living section, built for 12 and now housing 3. Merritt, the senior relay tech, regarded every incoming vessel as a scheduling problem. Fenn, the census analyst, built mechanical toys and left them on every horizontal surface in the common room. And then there was me, the cartographer who couldn't keep his mouth shut, now running bioscan confirmations 8 hours a day. It was not an unpleasant life. The scanner arrays were old but well-maintained, and the work had the same rhythm as mapping. Vessel arrives, manifest submitted, passengers cycle through the scanner bay, data confirmed against registry, transit pass issued or held for review. You were building an accurate record of what existed. That was not nothing. I had been at Verath for 4 months when the freighter de Las Mir came through. It was a mid-weight cargo transport, registered out of the Orvan cluster, running a standard commercial route. Manifest listed a crew of 9 and 2 passengers. The crew processed quickly. All 9 scanned clean, matched their registry entries without flags, were issued transit passes inside 20 minutes. First passenger processed just as smoothly. A young male academic carrying geological samples and a research credential from a university. Recognized. The second passenger was listed as Gera Orval, occupation mineral surveyor, travel purpose commercial transit. Domicile address a mid-tier residential district in the Orvan capital. Her documentation was impeccable. The transit pass was correctly formatted. The identification coding matched across all 3 verification layers, and when she walked into the scanner bay, she presented her credentials. Without hesitation, in the practiced way of someone who crossed transit checkpoints regularly. She was not tall. Ash-rose skin, a warm, soft coloration I hadn't encountered in the transited population before, closer to the deep interior worlds than the cluster periphery. Hair was ivory white, braided close to her head in a tight functional style that kept it off her face and neck. Her eyes were pale silver green, the kind of color that reads differently in different light. almost gray under the scanner bay's overhead panels, almost luminous when she turned toward the array emitter. She was wearing a worker's transit suit, charcoal and practical, and she carried one bag. She stepped onto the scan plate without being asked, set her bag to the side without being asked, at the array housing directly while the emitters ran their sweep. I was watching the output screen. The scan took 11 seconds. Standard bioscan is a 9-second process. The extra 2 seconds were the system running extended verification, which it does automatically when the first pass produces an output that requires classification review. The output that came back was a bloodline flag. I had processed by that point approximately 4,000 individual bioscan results at Verath. I had perhaps 24 flags in that time, and I could classify all of them on site: gene therapy markers, therapeutic modifications, species-ambiguous genomes, clerical mismatches where a passenger's legal name had changed and the registry hadn't been updated. I knew what flags looked like. This was not one of those. What the screen showed me was a code string I had never seen in operational output. I had seen it once in the relay's documentation archive, a dense, technical reference document that covered legacy classification codes from the census system's earlier iterations. The code was part of a historical category the archive called lineage designation, primary, which had been used before the current registry system replaced it, to mark biological profiles that carried the full genetic complement of a recognized sovereign line, not a royal claim, not a title or a credential. Biological fact, the kind of thing that didn't require paperwork because it was written in the genome itself. The code the screen was showing me belonged to the House of Orvan. I looked at the code for a moment. Then I looked at the passenger standing on the scan plate. She was looking at the array housing, not at me, patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting for bureaucratic processes to complete. I checked the relay census registry. The entry for the House of Orvan, sovereign line, read as follows: lineage status, extinct. Date of extinguishment, 11 years, 3 months, 10 days prior to today. Basis, biological census confirmation, certified by 3 independent relay stations and ratified by the Orvan Agency Council in formal session. Extinct, a bloodline the galactic census said no longer existed. And yet here was the scan output, and here was the code string, and here was the scan output again, because I had run the verification sequence a second time while I was reading the registry entry, and the output had not changed. I said, "I need to hold your transit pass for a moment. The scan has returned a flag that requires manual review." She turned her eyes from the array housing to me. Pale silver green shifted in the overhead light. "It will have been an instrument error," she said. Her voice was even. She spoke the transit corridor's common tongue without accent. "These arrays are old. Flag it as a calibration artifact, and it will clear." It was not the first time I had heard that sentence. It had been said to me with different words but identical structure across 23 years. Traces were instrument artifacts. The thermal gradients were calibration noise. Flag it and move on. "The arrays are old," I agreed. "I maintain them myself. They were recalibrated 12 days ago. I can show you the calibration logs if that would be helpful." She was quiet for a moment. "Please just clear the flag," she said. There was something in the way she said it that stopped me. Not a command. Not a threat. It was a request that had been made before, in other scan rooms at other relay stations, and it had always worked, and she knew it had always worked, and she was asking me to be the same as the others, quiet, willing to write down what someone else needed the record to say, instead of what the instrument was telling me. I had written those kinds of records before. I had been good at it for a long time, before I stopped being good at it. "Run the verification sequence a third time," I said. I ran it. The output was the same. A code string the census called extinct. A bloodline that had been formally confirmed as gone by 3 relay stations and ratified by the Orvan Regency Council. Alive in the genome of the woman standing 12 feet from me in a mineral surveyor's transit suit, looking at me with those pale silver-green eyes, and not saying anything at all. The silence in the scanner bay was the kind that has weight to it. I understood Sasa in that silence, several things at once. She had crossed checkpoints before, and the flag had been cleared each time. She knew exactly what language to use, and she had used it on me without hesitation. A bloodline doesn't get declared extinct by 3 relay stations and a regency council by accident. That requires coordination, and coordination requires someone who benefits from the declaration. The Orvan Regency Council had been administering the cluster for 11 years in the absence of a recognized sovereign line, and a living member of that primary lineage would end that administration. And I was a retired cartographer on a half-dead relay station, and none of that was my problem unless I decided it was. I looked at the scan output for a while. I looked at the code string, and the bloodline designation, and the registry entry that said, extinct, with a date and a ratification seal. Then I looked at her. You've been doing this for 11 years, I said. It was not a question. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, voice had changed. Not much, but enough to notice if you were paying attention. Doing what, she said. Crossing checkpoints. Watching the flag come up. Telling the station operator it's an instrument error. Moving on. Silence. How many times has it worked, I said. Every time, she said. Until now. There was nothing in her voice when she said it that I could easily name, not fear, not anger. Something older than either. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing a situation for so long that the managing has become indistinguishable from the living. What's your name, I said. Your actual name. Another silence. Longer this time. Jerael, she said. Jerael Orvan. I had known it before she said it, because the scan had told me. Hearing it, spoken aloud in the quiet of the scanner bay, was a different thing. The Orvan line went back 940 years in the cluster's historical record. Queens. For the most part, it was a matrilineal succession, with a handful of kings and regents scattered through the centuries. The current regency had begun when the last confirmed member of the line died, and the Regency Council had been declared the governing authority pending biological confirmation of a successor. 11 years later, the council had petitioned for and received census ratification of extinction. Except that the census had been wrong, and I had the output on my screen to prove it, and I had the calibration logs to establish that the output was not an instrument artifact. I said, how long do we have before someone notices the Delismere hasn't cleared the checkpoint and filed a hold report? She looked at me. You're not going to clear the flag, she said. I'm not going to clear the flag. The pale silver-green eyes held on me for a moment. There was something in them that I didn't know how to read yet, something between caution and a question she wasn't sure she should ask. Council has enforcement authorization in this corridor, she said. If they receive a flag report on the Orvan bloodline from a relay station, they will dispatch a boarding team. They have done it before. In those cases, the station operator. She paused. In those cases, the station operator typically cooperated with the boarding team. I would imagine so, I said. Tell you. The scan is an error. They will have documentation. They might. They will have a great deal more authority than you do. That's very likely true. She was studying me in the way of someone trying to understand a thing that isn't behaving the way it should. Why, she said. I thought about that. It was a fair question, and it deserved a careful answer. I spent 23 years making maps, I said. I was good at it. The thing you learn, doing that work, is that the instrument doesn't have an interest in the outcome. It shows you what's there. It doesn't care whether what's there is convenient for anybody. It doesn't care whether the official record agrees with it or not. My job was to read what the instrument showed me and write it down accurately. I looked at the screen, got reassigned because I kept doing that when other people needed me to stop. I'm not sure I'm able to stop. She was quiet again. The overhead panels hummed. Somewhere in the docking cradles, the Delismere systems cycled through a waiting hold protocol. The open relay, she said finally. The Transit Authority transmission feed. If the scan result went into that, before the council's enforcement team arrived, it can't be intercepted or amended once it's in the permanent record. That's the point of the open relay. The only channel in this corridor that nobody owns. How long will it take? 3 minutes. Maybe 4. The result is already verified. And after that? After that, it's in the permanent record. The Orvan bloodline will no longer be listed as extinct, and the Regency Council's governing authority becomes legally questionable. The census ratification they obtained 11 years ago becomes challengeable. I paused. You understand what that means? Yes, she said. I've known what it means for 11 years. I looked at the screen one more time, the code string, the bloodline flag, everything the instrument had said. Then I'll initiate the transmission, I said. I did. The transmission sequence ran for 3 minutes and 48 seconds. Neither of us spoke. The relay hummed. The overhead panels cast their even light on the scanner bay floor. The transmission completed. The open relay confirmed receipt. The screen showed the confirmation code, and under it the amended census status, lineage status, active. Bloodline carrier confirmed, station. Verith relay, operator Corindes. Timestamp current. I printed the confirmation to hard copy and held it out to her. She crossed the scanner bay and took it. She read it slowly. The way you read something you've been waiting 11 years to see. And when she looked up, her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite tears but lived in the same country. Wet but composed, the release that happens quietly, without spectacle. There will be a hold flag on this station as soon as the council picks up the transmission, I said. When they arrive, I'll still be here, she said. You don't have to be. Yes, I do. If I run again, the proceedings will be slower. She folded the hard copy carefully. I've been running for 11 years. I'm tired of running. I understood that. I called Merritt on the internal channel and told her to prepare a hold status notification and flag the council enforcement frequency for approach vectors. Then I sat down at the operator's station and began writing my notation, because notation was part of the protocol, and I intended to do this with every procedural safeguard intact. Jeriel Orvan sat down in the waiting chair across from the operator station and watched me write. After a while she said, "You know what they'll say about the scan, that it was contaminated, that the arrays were miscalibrated, that there was an operator error." "Yes," I said. "And you know that my documentation, the surveyor's papers, the transit pass, they'll say it was forged, that I manufactured a false identity and used it to fraudulently claim a sovereign bloodline." "They'll say several things," I said. "They'll be thorough about it. Does that concern you?" I finished the sentence I was writing before I answered. "I have the calibration logs dated 12 days ago," I said. 3 sequential scan outputs, all identical, with timestamps. The verification sequence records, the transmission log, the permanent record confirmation. I set down the notation stylus. And 23 years of survey work that establishes I know how to read an instrument and tell the difference between a calibration artifact and a genuine output. I've been told my instruments were wrong before. I was wrong to write those things down. I'm not going to be wrong about it again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who were they? The ones who told you your instruments were wrong." I told her about the Ketheri deeps, the settlement traces, the reports filed and returned, the calibrated equipment with its preset exclusions, the pleasant conversation with the senior administrator. She listened with complete attention, the way of someone who recognizes a story from the inside, who has lived a version of it herself. When I finished, she said, "Did you ever find out what was there? In the Ketheri deeps?" "I have a theory," I said. "I've never been able to confirm it. There's nobody left to confirm it." "But you think the traces were real." "I know the traces were real. What I don't know is who they belonged to." She was quiet again, in a different way this time, thinking rather than waiting. "After this is over," she said, "if the proceedings go the way I believe they will, I'll have certain administrative resources available, including survey authorization for restricted regions." A pause. "The Orvan cluster touches the Ketheri boundary. It's within my territorial jurisdiction." I looked at her. "You're offering to authorize a survey of the Ketheri deeps." "I'm saying it's within my authority to do so," she said carefully. "I'm not in any position to make formal offers at the moment. I'm sitting in a transit scanner bay, on a half-decommissioned relay station waiting for an enforcement team to arrive." There was something that was not quite a smile at the corner of her mouth. Not broad, just present, the kind of expression that surfaces when someone has been serious for so long that a small humor becomes visible. "But yes, that's what I'm saying. That's a generous thing to offer someone who just complicated your day considerably." "You didn't complicate my day," she said. "You ended 11 years. The comms board chimed. Marit's voice came through. "Council enforcement vessel on approach. 14 minutes out." I acknowledged the call and looked at the screen. The transmission confirmation was still there, with its timestamp and its operator notation and its permanent record acknowledgement. The scan output was still there. All of it was in the record now, and the record could not be changed. I printed additional copies of the confirmation and the scan record and them in the station's physical archive. Because physical archives are harder to remote delete than digital ones, and I had learned a long time ago not to rely on any single copy of an important document. Jeriel Orvan watched me do this without comment. When I finished, she said, "The enforcement team will board. They'll want to take me aboard their vessel for questioning." "I'll contest the boarding," I said. A transit checkpoint facility operates under transit authority jurisdiction. An enforcement team cannot compel removal of a named individual without transit authority authorization, and a named individual with a registered bloodline status has the right to remain until the authority acknowledges the registration. I had looked this up in the relay's regulatory archive while writing the notation. They won't process the acknowledgement quickly. During that time, you remain here. She was studying me again with that same expression, the one I had begun to recognize as the face of someone trying to understand, a thing that isn't behaving the way it should. "You looked up the regulations," she said. "I looked up the regulations," I confirmed. "You looked the regulations while writing the notation." "It's a quiet checkpoint. There's time." Something shifted in her expression. Something that had been held carefully in place for a long time, and was now resting, just slightly, in a way it hadn't rested in some time. "Corin Des," she said. The words were deliberate, the way you say a name when you want the person to hear it, not just acknowledge it. "I want you to know that I understand what this will cost you, the posting, the assignment, quiet life you've been managing to have." I thought about that. I wasn't managing it especially well, I said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but had something of a laugh in it. It was a good sound, honest and briefly unguarded. "No," she said, "probably not." We waited together for the enforcement vessel. The scan room's overhead panels hummed. The permanent record held what it held. Outside in the transit corridor, vessels passed through the null point on their way between the cluster and the inner systems, and the universe continued to have the shape it had always had. Except for one small entry in the census register that had been wrong for 11 years and was now corrected. The enforcement team was thorough. They were also confident about the regulations until I showed them the regulatory archive citation, at which point they began making calls. The transit authority took 4 hours and 17 minutes to acknowledge the registration. I documented every minute of it, because documentation is the only instrument that doesn't require calibration. When the acknowledgement came through, the council enforcement team stood down. Their commander looked at Jeriel Orvan with an expression I didn't like, then looked at me with the look of a man memorizing a station identification for future use. "You've opened a significant procedural dispute," he told me. "I've filed an accurate scan record," I said. "The record will be contested. It has timestamps, calibration logs, permanent archive confirmation." Contest away. He left. The enforcement vessel released its hold on the cradle and withdrew to monitoring. Distance. Close enough to watch. Far enough that they couldn't claim jurisdiction over anything happening on the station. Jeriel Orvan stood near the scan bay doorway and watched them go. In the absence of the enforcement team, the scanner bay was very quiet. The notation was complete. The physical copies were in the archive. The digital record was in the permanent register. The instrument had been read, and its output had been written down. She turned from the doorway and looked at me. "The transit authority's acknowledgement will trigger a formal claimant hearing in the cluster capital," she said. "That process will take months. During that time, there will be a great deal of noise. I imagine so. The council will attempt to discredit the scan record. They will attempt to discredit you. They may succeed in complicating your circumstances considerably." "They may," I said. She was quiet for a moment, holding my eyes. The pale silver green in the relay's overhead light, composed and direct. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. 11 years ago, when the council began the extinguishment proceedings, I went to 6 relay stations along this corridor. In 5 of them, the operator cleared the flag without comment the moment I asked them to. In the sixth, the operator ran a second verification sequence, the way you did, and then cleared the flag when the enforcement team arrived. She paused. You're the first one who held the record. I looked at her for a moment. What was the plant? I said. She blinked. It was the last time. Her looked genuinely uncertain. The plant? She said. In the Delasmere's passenger manifest, your cargo declaration listed personal effects and a small live plant, genus unspecified. I noted it when I processed the manifest, and I've been meaning to ask. The corner of her mouth moved again. That same small, honest expression. Cutting, she said. From the palace gardens in the cluster capital. The original was planted by the first queen of the Orvan line, 940 years ago. A pause. I took a cutting when I left. I've kept it alive for 11 years. It doesn't grow well in transit containers. The light isn't right and the soil compacts. But it survives. I thought about that. Something fragile and alive, kept growing in containers with bad light. Across 11 years of checkpoints, and enforcement teams and cleared flags. Surviving. That's a hard thing to keep, I said. Yes, she said. It is, but it's harder to let something die when you know it doesn't have to. She said it simply, without emphasis, and I understood that she was not only talking about the plant. I stood up from the operator station and crossed the scanner bay. I held out my hand, the same hand that had initiated the transmission sequence, the same hand that had printed the confirmation hard copy, and after a brief moment she took it. A formal grip, the kind exchanged between people who have just done something that cannot be undone, and who are clear about that fact. Corin Des, she said, the same deliberate way she had said it before. A name spoken to be heard. Jerael Orvan, I said, the first time I had spoken it aloud. It sat differently in the air of the scanner bay than it had on the screen. Fuller, more real in the way that true things are always more real when they are spoken than when they are only written down. She looked at me a moment longer. Welcome back, I said. For whatever that's worth, from a scan operator on a half-dead relay, something crossed her face that I don't have the right words for. 11 years is a long time to be told you don't exist, and the moment when that stops is not a simple one. Her eyes were bright and steady, wet but not broken, the way people look when relief and strength have become the same thing. It's worth a great deal, she said. It's worth exactly what you think it's worth. The enforcement vessel was still on monitoring distance when she went back to the Delasmere that evening, accompanied by the Transit Authority notification of pending formal proceedings and 3 hardcopy confirmations of the census amendment in a sealed packet. The packet also contained a survey authorization form pre-signed for the Kathuri Deeps region. She had filled it out at the operator station while I was logging the enforcement team's visit in the station incident record. Didn't notice her doing it until she set the completed form on the desk beside me. I picked it up and read it. It was correctly formatted, fully authorized, and would be legally valid from the moment she regained formal standing, which, given the permanent record now in the census register, was a matter of process rather than possibility. I looked at her. She looked at me. The Orvan line has a tradition, she said, of honoring the debts it owes. 940 years of it. My ancestors were very clear on the subject. She paused. So am I. I put the survey authorization in the physical archive with the other documents. In the morning, the Delasmere departed the docking cradle and rejoined the transit corridor. I watched it go from the relay's observation window, a clean, diminishing point of light in the null field, moving toward the cluster. The enforcement vessel followed it at a distance, as I had expected it would. I went back to the scanner bay and sat down at the operator station. The screen still showed the transmission confirmation. I had been leaving it up, not out of sentiment, but because I wanted to see it plainly for a while. The code string, the bloodline designation, the amended status, timestamp, what the instrument had said and what I had written down. I read it one more time. Then I closed the display and began the morning calibration cycle, because the next vessels in the transit queue would be arriving in 2 hours, and the arrays needed to be sharp. The calibration logs, if anyone ever looked at them, show that the Verith Relay's bioscan arrays had been performing at precise specification on the day in question. Within tolerance. Accurate. I knew that. I had known it before I ran the 3rd verification sequence. Some things you check twice. Some things you check 3 times. Not because you doubt the instrument, but because accuracy is worth the extra time. It always has been.